BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Okay, hello everybody. Today is Friday, another Anything Goes Friday. Welcome to the show. Firstly, I would like to thank everyone who heard the recent episodes that I've done on this channel about the Zodiac Killer, as well as the Phantom Killer, a serial killer who operated in 1946 in the town of Texarkana. But today is when I revisit the story of Stephen Avery, who was made famous by the Netflix docuseries Making a Murderer, and I will be discussing the book Illusion of Justice by Jerome F. Buting, who was a defense attorney for Stephen Avery, also known as Jerry Buting, and that's the way that I'll be referring to him throughout this recording. This story begins in 2005, but it even begins about 18 years before that, maybe even 20 years before that, when Stephen Avery was accused and convicted of the sexual assault and attempted murder of a woman named Penny Bernstein in the 1980s. He then spent 18 years in jail for a crime that he did not commit. He was exonerated because of DNA evidence, and they learned that the real perpetrator in that case was named Gregory Allen. Then, 2 years after he is out of jail, Stephen Avery is sent back to jail and then prison later on for the 2005 murder of Teresa Hallback. But there are two people who are convicted in that one, Stephen Avery and his nephew, Brendan Dassey. And this book, Illusion of Justice, really focuses on the involvement or possible involvement of Brendan Dassey in the crime, talking about the 2005 murder of Teresa Hallback. In a lot of the previous episodes, I've stated very clearly that I think there's almost a universal consensus that Stephen Avery did not commit the sexual assault on Penny Bernstein. I mean, it would be an uphill battle for someone to try and claim that he did. Almost certainly not. But with the 2005 murder of Teresa Hallback, it is a very gruesome story, and it's a very saddening story. Teresa Hallback was a photographer who was working with Auto Trader, and she was going to take some photos of vehicles on the Avery property. The Averys owned a salvage yard having well over 3,000 vehicles, a very large salvage yard, and Teresa was going to photograph some of them, and she was never seen alive again. Now, did this actually take place the way that the authorities said that it did? Well, if you read the book Illusion of Justice by Jerry Buting, you'll hear the prosecution's take on the subject, you'll hear some counter-arguments and rebuttals, you'll also hear what a lawyer thinks. But I have to give you the disclaimer that this book is not only about the story of Stephen Avery and the story of Brendan Dassey and Teresa Hallback. It's called Illusion of Justice Inside Making a Murderer and America's Broken Justice System. And there's an emphasis on the part of America's broken justice system because it isn't so much about the case as it is what does Jerry Buting think about certain things. And it's also stories from his life. He talks about being a cross-country runner back in high school. He talks about his own battle with cancer. He talks about being a father. And it's his commentary on not only being a lawyer, but life in general. And I felt very conflicted when I was reading this book because I really wanted to hear more about the story of Stephen Avery, but what I found was the slight possibility that Jerry Buting may have been trying to cash in on his 15 minutes of fame. And cash in, I should use in the figurative sense. I think he was more or less having his moment in the sun, rather, and this is his opportunity to share what he thinks with the country as well as the world. But I did say that the book focuses a lot on the involvement of Brendan Dassey, two participants in the murder of Teresa Halbach, and one of the absolute biggest challenges for lawyers in this case is that Brendan Dassey, Stephen Avery's nephew, confessed to involvement with the murder of Teresa Halbach, and there's a beginning section here in the book, and this is from page 10. The 16-year-old juvenile admitted his involvement in the death of Teresa Halbach, as well as Stephen Avery's involvement in this matter. And that's a direct quotation, but I should also note that at the time of this recording, both Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey are currently incarcerated for Teresa's murder. Then Jerry Buting asks some challenge questions to the reader. How had he come to confess? What did he say had happened? Was there any evidence to show that what he said was true? Well, to respond to the first challenge question, how did he come to confess? There are two conflicting theories. The first is that he told the authorities what actually happened. That's what the prosecution made out. And the second is that he was duped, deceived, that he was not aware of what he was confessing to, or the magnitude of the situation, the gravity of the situation, the severity of the crimes involved. And I have to take a very strong stance on this case. When it comes to Stephen Avery's involvement in Teresa Halbach's murder, I could see how a jury could go one way or the other, but to convict Brendan Dassey of any type of involvement, I don't see how a jury would do that, because they're not supposed to convict if there's reasonable doubt. And I see enormous amounts of reasonable doubt in Brendan Dassey's case. I don't know how on earth anyone would be able to think that he actually was a participant, or that he was a participant beyond the shadow of a doubt. What happened to Teresa Halbach, though, and how did this murder take place? Well, I would like to jump ahead to page 27 in the book, when Jerry Buting has a reconstruction of the prosecution's narrative. 16-year-old Brendan Dassey, who lives next door to Stephen Avery in a trailer, returned home on a bus from school at about 3:45 p.m. He retrieved the mail and noticed that one of the letters was for his uncle Stephen Avery. As Brendan approaches the trailer, he actually gets several hundred feet away from the trailer, a long, long way from it. Brendan already starts to hear the screams. As Brendan approaches the trailer, he hears the screams getting louder for help, and he recognizes the voice of a female individual, or he recognizes the voice to be a female individual. He knocks on Stephen Avery's trailer door. Brendan says that he knocks at least 3 times, and he has to wait until the person he knows as his uncle, who is partially dressed and in full sweat, opens the door and greets him. Kratz continued by saying that Brendan accompanies his sweaty 43-year-old uncle down the hallway to Stephen Avery's bedroom. There they find Teresa Halbach, a completely naked woman, shackled to the bed. Teresa Halbach is begging for her life, and especially begging for Brendan to save her. The evidence that we've uncovered establishes that Stephen Avery at this point invites his 16-year-old nephew to sexually assault the woman that he has bound to the bed. During the rape, Teresa is begging for help, begging 16-year-old Brendan Dassey to stop, saying that he can stop this. Now, that is the narrative that's been established by the prosecution, and they also share some other details that they believe that Stephen Avery held Teresa's legs open with leg irons that he was using as the type of shackle, and that both Stephen and Brendan were participants in the sexual assault, and absolutely horrible and gruesome stuff. But it's important to note that even though there was a confession, Brendan Dassey retracted his confession, and he may not have been completely aware of what he was saying, but there is also the statement from Stephen Avery where he has maintained his innocence entirely throughout the whole trial, as well as the post-conviction appeals. He has always maintained his innocence, and that's not even something that we see all the time. Why is there so much focus on Stephen Avery to begin with? Well, he was imprisoned for 18 years for a crime that he was wrongfully convicted of, and he was doing public appearances, and he filed a $36 million lawsuit for the wrongful conviction. And some people think that he was framed because the county and the state didn't want to deal with anything to do with that lawsuit, and this was a way to get him out of the picture. But I want to point to something else that is discussed in the book Illusion of Justice here, and Jerry Buting wants to remind us that sometimes detectives, investigators, and members of law enforcement can choose a suspect, and they zone in on the suspect, and they refuse to back down from their observation. Sometimes it's called fingering a suspect. But I want to point out that as someone who talks about this stuff with you guys here on Black Box Online Radio, this does happen rather frequently in the true crime world. Last year I did an episode called Interrogation, the Murder of Dorca Lisker. And let's pay a close attention to that word, interrogation. But that was all about how a man named Bruce Lisker was charged and convicted for the murder of his mother, Dorca Lisker, and one of the major reasons, in fact, the biggest reason why he was convicted was a detective named Andrew Monsu zoned in on him as the suspect and refused to look at any of the contradictory evidence, and he is building this case all against Bruce Lisker for the crime, and ultimately the conviction was overturned after Bruce Lisker spent 26 years in prison. But even after getting out, Andrew Monsu, the detective, still stood by everything that he was saying, and sometimes the detectives get it in their mind, and members of law enforcement, not only detectives, police officers, and other people of a similar sort, get it in their mind that this person is guilty, and they only want to extract evidence that is going to favor the guilt of one person, not based on what actually happened. And there is also a statement early on in the book, Illusion of Justice, when Jerry Buting talks about a different aspect of the prosecution, and it's not law enforcement, but the attorneys themselves, when he says that most lawyers are very ethical and they aren't only thinking about racking up convictions. Now, he is an attorney, and I am not, but I don't necessarily think that that is true. It's my understanding that being a lawyer, especially a trial lawyer or like a litigator, is about winning. That when they say you have the right to a fair trial, that means that your attorney is trying to win the case. And I think that that is the absolute central point there, because at that point, racking up convictions, it's not even like the focus. I think that the phrasing is a misleading and distorting way of putting it. What I think is much closer to the actual truth that we deal with as people who are not lawyers is the lawyer is trying to win no matter what. Now, are lawyers going to falsify things and do deceptive means? I mean, are they going to do straight up illegal things? I think a lot of them would if they weren't going to get caught. I think anybody would do something if they knew they weren't going to get caught, whether it's burying evidence or, what was that one show that I was watching? I think it was a, fictionalized, I don't remember. Oh no, it was Interrogation. Yeah, yeah, about the, murder of Dorca Lisker. They made a show up on Paramount Plus. It's a Paramount Plus original called Interrogation. That's how I got the name. And all the names for that program have been changed. Bruce Lisker is named Eric Fisher. The detective Andrew Monsu is named Dave Russell. But they really stay true to the facts of the case, and they find contradictory evidence that goes against Bruce Lisker's guilt in the murder of his mother, and then they just say, well, the jury can't see this, and I think that that's exactly it. It's about winning, and it's about trying to present an interpretation of the evidence that allows the attorney to win the case. And if anyone does read this book, Illusion of Justice by Jerry Buting, there are a lot of pieces of info from his life that aren't relevant to the Avery case, even talking about some other trials that he worked on. But the book really comes alive in the parts around page 170, and it's all about the heart and soul issues that I was hoping to get to, and I would like to read something from page 171 in the chapter called Swimming Upstream. Because of the act of speaking against one's own interests seems counterintuitive, false confessions are extraordinarily dangerous evidence, and juries give confessions a great deal of credence, even when they show signs of being drastically unreliable, as Brendan Dassey's confession did. He revealed nothing trustworthy about the death of Teresa Hallback, but was a living, breathing gauge of the great lengths to which the prosecution team in the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office were willing to go in their pursuit of Stephen Avery. From the outset, Ken Kratz, the prosecutor's description of Brendan Dassey's confession at the press conference on March 2nd of 2006, which was echoed in the details of the criminal complaint, that Teresa Hallback had first been stabbed, then her throat was slit, then strangled, and finally shot, sounded ridiculous to me. And indeed, not long after Kratz so triumphantly declared, "We have now determined what occurred sometime between 3:45 p.m. and 10 or 11 p.m. on the 31st of October when Teresa died," the wheels started to fly off. Contrary to Kratz's pronouncement, the prosecution did not know what happened to Teresa Hallback on October 31st of 2005 because Brendan himself didn't know. Reports from the forensic laboratory were coming in at a dizzying pace, and one of them was even backed up by Brendan's account, including the discovery of materials were videos and transcript of Brendan's confession, which revealed that even with tireless coaching and cajoling from experienced investigators, Brendan could not provide a coherent account of the torture and murder in which he claimed to have participated in. In virtually every case where DNA has revealed the innocence of a person who had confessed, the suspect had offered specific details that only the real killer and investigators would know. How could this be? These innocent people were picking up the incriminating information from their interrogators. The tape and transcripts here unmistakably showed that this was the case during the questioning of Brendan Dassey by Detective Mark Wiegert of the Kalmar County Sheriff's Office and Special Agent Tom Fossbender of the Wisconsin Division of the Criminal Investigation. Brendan's story drifts around about what time he saw Stephen Avery on October 31st and whether he saw Teresa Hallback with Avery. But how long? How had she died? Brendan mentions stabbing her in the stomach. What else did he do to her? Pause. He did something else, we know that. Pause. What else? He tied her up. Brendan replies, "This apparently is not the answer they were looking for." So, they ask again. We know he did something else to her. What else did they do? What else did he do, it actually says. And this is an important thing to think about because if you didn't get the meaning of that section of text from Jerry Buting, what he's trying to say is that they're just asking open-ended questions. And when Brendan Dassey was not giving them the desired result, they start asking the question again in a different way to get that desired result, meaning that people are going to ultimately give information that only the police or the real killer would know if they are asked in a certain way. And this happens all the time. I mean, this happens in the true crime world all the time. One of the first stories that I heard about was the story of Michael Crow, a boy who confessed to murdering his sister, and they made I believe they made at least two films about him. One of them is called The Interrogation of Michael Crow, and it's all about how the police are pressuring him into confessing, and they're saying that we found your blood on her body. We know how you did it. You did it like this, and they're just trying to coerce him into confessing to a murder, but he didn't do it. And ultimately he confessed to it, but he didn't. Why did he confess? Because he wanted the interrogation to stop. The first person that I ever heard talk about coercion and interrogation tactics was Jesse Ventura, of all people, the former governor of Minnesota, when he simply said that a torture confession is inadmissible in court because so many people will confess to things under torturous conditions because they want the torture to stop. Well, when you think about an interrogation that is not physically torturous, and sometimes it's not even emotionally torturous, but sometimes, in the case of Brendan Dassey's interrogation, it is confusing. So then, what the authorities have done in this particular situation, as described by Jerry Buting, is they aren't using torturous tactics. They're trying to mislead and deceive Brendan Dassey into saying something that he doesn't truly understand. And most people will point out to the fact that Brendan Dassey was a special education student. They say that he had a below average IQ. But even beyond that, I mean, so many people of average intelligence, above average intelligence, could be deceived. They could end up being misled, or they could end up just saying something that they were caught up in because of misleading questions. When someone isn't giving the desired answer, well, then they ask the question in a different way to try and get that desired answer. And I would like to keep going in Jerry Buting's book here. This is from page 172. And there again, they're asking, we know he did something else to her. What else did he do to her? Talking about what Stephen Avery did to Teresa Hallback. After a moment, Brendan suggests, he choked her. Nope, still not correct. Weir gets more specific. What else did he do to her? We know he did something else. Tell us what he did to her. Come on. Something with the head, Brendan. This time, Brendan pauses for a long while, unable to guess what they want him to say. Finally, he comes up with something that could have happened. Then he cut her hair off. He says, no, not that. There was none of Teresa Hallback's hair that was found in the bedroom. Both detectives then began to throw questions at him. What else was done to her head? He punched her, Brendan says. What else? What else? He made you do something, didn't he? Fassbender asks. So he would feel better about not being the only person, right? Then Brendan nods and says, yeah. What did he make you do to her? What did he make you do, Brendan? And then they say, it's okay, it's okay. What did he make you do? And Brendan says, cut her. Cut her where? On her throat. So far, Brendan has described stabbing, choking, and punching her, and slitting her throat. He is guessing, but he's still not landing on a single solitary fact that can be corroborated with physical evidence which the lab results have uncovered just a few days earlier. A fragment of skull bone was recovered from Avery's burn pit and examined by the state's anthropologist and showed a small hole with minimal traces of lead and both signs of a gunshot wound. This fact had not yet been made public, so if Weird and Fassbender can get Brendan to disclose his shooting, it will seem like information that only the real killers could know, and thereby salvage Brendan's story and making him a believable participant in the murder, and thus a star witness against Stephen Avery. So Stephen stabs her first and then cuts her throat. Brendan nods yes. Well, what else happens to her head? It's extremely important that you tell us for us to believe. Come on, Brendan. And there was no reply. So then they asked, we know, you just need to tell us. That's all I can remember, said Brendan. And I should point out, though, that there are people who genuinely do believe that Brendan Dassey was guilty, and I just simply think that, no, he wasn't, but I also think that even based on the way that Jerry Buting has presented the interrogation tactics that have been used by the investigators, they're obviously trying to lead him to say something, and based on the way that this is presented here in the book Illusion of Justice, he's saying this stuff because he wants the interrogation to stop. But here's the kicker. Here is one of the most vital points in the entire book. They then say, all right, I'm just going to come out and ask you, who shot her in the head? And Brendan says, he did. And there it is. There it is. After he has finally confessed to their satisfaction, Fassbender demands that Brendan provide an explanation for why it has taken so long. And then Brendan replies, 'cause I couldn't think of it. Now, how is that going to be interpreted? 'Cause I couldn't think of it? Because he didn't want to remember something that was tragic and gruesome? Or because he didn't know what they wanted him to say? And this is something, though, that I think that close followers of true crime will understand. That sometimes people confess to things that they didn't actually do. Yes, it could be something like this, or the interrogation of Michael Crow, when people are pressured, I repeat, pressured into confessing to something. And in the past, they would also use more torturous techniques. But being very clear, I don't stand that Brendan Dassey was tortured, or that Michael Crow was even tortured. But those tactics have been used against enemy combatants as well as prisoners in the past, and even going back to the early part of the 20th century. So I think that a lot of us who follow the true crime cases closely can recognize that there are reasons why people confess to crimes that they didn't commit, but I don't think that this is widely accepted and understood in the general public. I used to watch the Steve Wilkos show a lot, and he would talk about how people would confess to crimes that they didn't commit, and they would also plead guilty to crimes that he didn't commit. And he's just like, I don't know, I don't understand this. How could you confess to something that you didn't do? How could you admit to something that you didn't do? How could you enter a guilty plea to something that you didn't do? And almost always, on the notion of pleading guilty, people would say, the lawyers. He's like, oh, I don't want to hear about the lawyers. You didn't do it. Why would you confess and then plead guilty? Well, the reasons why people would do that would be that they don't want to go to jail for life for something that they didn't do. Or I always go back to this episode of Dateline that I was watching once when someone, a defense attorney actually was talking about how his client was offered, was it 5 years? Yeah, 5 years in jail versus going to trial and facing a life sentence. And the lawyer said, if I were innocent, I would have taken that offer. I would have taken that deal because of the very fact that there was such a high chance that his client would have been convicted. So people admit to things that they didn't do and they plead guilty to things that they didn't do. And moreover, Bruce Lisker, Eric Fisher, the character in Interrogation, based on the character based on the real person Bruce Lisker, he confessed and admitted to murdering his mother about 4 different times when he was in prison. Why? Because of parole hearings, because he wanted to be granted parole. And then he quickly would reverse and just say, no, I didn't. I only said that because I was trying to get the parole board to let me out. And there's somewhat of a defendable and realistic reason why he would do that. And if you'd like to hear more, you can also go over to my episode Interrogation, The Murder of Dorka Lisker, available on this channel. I haven't done an episode yet on Michael Crow, but I perhaps could for the future. And if you'd like to support any of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88. There's a link to that in the description box. And anyone who makes a contribution or donation to support the show will get a shout out on Zodiac Mondays. And you also need to give a big thank you to a different Jerome from the French Wrecking Crew, who provided me with a copy of this book, Illusion of Justice. And even if this book is filled with stories of Jerry Buting's life and personal anecdotes, and what is it like being the father of a boy named Stephen, nonetheless, yes, he also had a son named Stephen, in addition to being the attorney for Stephen Avery. Those things are very, very interesting, but I really think that these 10 pages, 170 to 180, were just the most eye-opening when he just does this breakdown on how Brendan Dassey's confession seems almost certainly coerced. And there is another side story in the book that I wanted to save for the end, and it goes back to April 28th of 1994, talking about the story of James Oswald and his 18-year-old son, Ted Oswald. And I'll just read this from page 113. They robbed a bank in Wisconsin's Waukesha County, Waukesh, which is a suburb of just west of Milwaukee. They fled, but they were pursued by two police officers who stopped their vehicle. The Oswalds, armed with semi-automatic rifles, got out of their car and shot at the officers, killing one of them, a police captain. A chase ensued, during which the two suspects broke into a home and abducted a woman as a hostage and continued to flee in her van. A local television station was following the pursuit on a radio police scanner and heard that the police were about to set up a roadblock nearby. A reporter and photojournalist with a camera arrived at the scene at the site of the roadblock just in time to broadcast what was taking down. As the suspects approached the stolen van, they accelerated and rammed into a police car blocking the road. Police opened fire and stopped the van, and the Oswalds jumped out into the hail of bullets. The hostage jumped out too. Miraculously, the woman was not seriously hurt. Accelerating again rapidly, the suspects drove a van a few hundred feet further until they smashed into a tree. They were captured alive. And if you'd like to hear more about the story of the Oswalds of Wisconsin, you can also get that in Jerry Buting's book. But I was reminded of the story of the Santa Claus bank robbery from 1927, and I did a recent episode about that here on this channel, where I was discussing the events of that because there's something very similar that took place, and this episode is filled with patterns in the true crime world. And one thing that bank robbers do is they take hostages, and then they use the hostages as human shields and bargaining chips. And a very similar course of events took place with the Santa Claus bank robbery. And I was discussing a chapter in the book Lone Wolf Gonzalez, Texas Ranger. Lone Wolf Gonzalez was an active participant in the search and manhunt for these Santa Claus bank robbers. And one more time, you can visit that episode here on my channel. There are over 1,000 episodes of Black Box Online Radio, so you can like and subscribe, follow along with all of these true crime discussions. And as I said, visit some of the links in the description box. Well, that will be all for me now, and anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNet88 over on Instagram. And one more time, the book is called Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murderer in America's Broken Justice System by Jerry Buting. And a big rest in peace to Teresa Hallback. And the final point that I would say before signing off is, what do you think about Jerry Buting's assessment of the Brendan Dassey confession? Does it sound coerced? Or do you disagree completely, and do you think that he is just misrepresenting the facts because he was a defense attorney? Please share your idea in the comment section down below. I have given my response in about 30 minutes here, but take as much time as you need in the comment section. All for me now. Until next time.